What many companies have done, though, is that they have used the European GDPR as their global privacy policy. Even the leading tech companies, including Meta and Google and Apple and Microsoft, use the GDPR not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world. And I see two potential trends contributing this potential move towards a simplification and deregulation. So I'm also not willing to say that all the regulations kill innovation. And I arrived at these four reasons that to me are much more fundamental in explaining why the US has innovated so much more than Europe in this space. And I must say that this is really working against this idea that if we now understand how important immigration has been for the tech success of the country. So the United States risks undermining the very pillar of success, what has made the US so tremendously successful.
So in this section, we will explore why regulations are essential to business and society. Business of digital data-driven services pulls firms toward scale, scope, and speed. Unlike the tangible world where you hit an optimal point, in connected tangibles, every extra customer both spreads fixed cost and makes the product better. So value per user rises while cost per user falls. Adding more service in one place boosts convenience and reuses the same data cloud stack. So value rises and cost per service drops. And shipping faster via cloud and agile brings in users quickly and widens the bundle, giving early movers a data and future lead. Put together, this creates winner takes most dynamics. In Gen AI-powered connected intangible markets, regulations focuses on two buckets: right protection, preventing misuse, leakage of personal data; opaque or black box decisions, harmful or unauthorized content and unfair treatment. Abuse of market dominance stops platforms from imposing one-sided terms using predatory pricing to squeeze rivals or restricting user choice. Professor, which tools work best for each bucket in practice, and where do you see the biggest enforcement gaps companies should prepare for?
So in many ways, I see these issues very interrelated. That in partially because these technology companies, the leading platforms, have created this kind of surveillance capitalism model whereby they are monetizing the vast troves of data, personal data on individuals. They have managed to become so big that they are now in a position to abuse their market dominance. And now this market dominance then ensures that the users don't have alternatives. So even if the user doesn't like the surveillance capitalism and the way one's data is being used, they don't have alternative platforms to turn to. And that just only sustains the market dominance of these companies. So there are some scholars who argue that the solution is really to focus on the size of these companies. We should be breaking up the big tech companies. The United States has been now pursuing antitrust cases, asking for the breakup of a company such as Google, or retroactively unwinding the acquisitions of Facebook, of the WhatsApp and Instagram. So Recently, there was a setback in the court where the court did not agree to order a breakup, but this idea of strong antitrust remedies still loom large, partially because there's an understanding that antitrust competition policy has been a more potent tool. Those remedies have been more effective than privacy remedies. The enforcement gaps have been much more glaring in the privacy space, where we have less resourceful, less experienced regulatory agencies trying to pursue these violations. So that has also led to some cases where the privacy infringements have been treated as a part of the dominance problem, so that we could use that more effective regulatory framework around antitrust or market competition. But even the market competition, the antitrust laws have gaps. The European Union has fined Google around 10 billion across 4 different antitrust cases. Yet Google's market dominance is pretty much unshaken in the European Union. So there's an understanding that even antitrust enforcement still leaves much to be desired. But I think there's even greater concern that the privacy enforcement has not been effective to date.
Japan's AI guidelines for business boils down to 10 neutral principles: human-centric, safety, fairness, privacy, security, transparency, accountability, education, fair competition, and innovation. The 3 bullets at the bottom are our additions: reduce information asymmetry, transaction cost, clarify liability for AI-caused harm, and pair rules with pro-innovation measures. Regulation itself should be neutral. For instance, it has a high bar for small and medium-sized enterprises in EU to comply the regulation without large investment. Another example, Apple aligned early with EU privacy requirement, while Meta failed to meet parts of the EU regime and was fined. Reinforcing equality and fairness by holding every player to the same order. Next, let us analyze the EU and US regulations. Could you first walk us through the practical differences between the EU's right-based GDPR model and the US patchwork? What that means for how companies design product and handle data?
So the European Union really is known for having a robust privacy law, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that has become a global gold standard. So it is a horizontal regulation that applies to all sectors of the economy. Whereas the United States has much more of what you call a patchwork approach. There is no federal privacy law in the United States. Yet there are many state-level privacy laws, including a very important law in California, but also in many other states. The companies don't like the patchwork. They don't like the idea that there are differences across different states, because that is cumbersome for them to comply with. In the US, there's another element whereby there are many sectoral privacy laws that again adds more complexity to the compliance picture. What many companies have done, though, is that they have used the European GDPR as their global privacy policy. Even the leading tech companies, including Meta and Google and Apple and Microsoft, use the GDPR not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world. They may sometimes tweak it and add something in another jurisdiction that doesn't exist in the GDPR, but the baseline is the protection set out in the GDPR. And that was also a model for California's privacy law, where California emulated many of the provisions of the GDPR when enacting its own law. So Those are the leading privacy laws, the GDPR, but I would say also the California law. But there is a continuing conversation in the United States whether there is a need to try to do something in the federal level because of the cumbersome complexity of different laws. There have been many bills proposed in Congress, but so far nothing has been adopted at the federal level in the United States.
And the second, it seems that there are emerging doubts within the EU about further regulatory expansion. Let's say, over the next 5 years, through the end of the Trump term in 2029, do you foresee the EU's right-driven approach moving more toward deregulation?
There is certainly a risk that that will happen, and I see two potential trends contributing this potential move towards a simplification and deregulation. One is the external threat that we have discussed when the United States and Trump administration are pushing back against the European regulations. They are labeling this regulation as discriminatory, as unfair, and basically saying that the Europeans will face tariffs unless they roll back these regulations. Interestingly, in the preliminary US-EU trade deal that was reached to resolve the conflicts over tariffs, the Europeans did not make compromises on digital regulation. They did not capitulate to US demands, but those pressures continue, and we'll see whether they will have an effect. But I also see another trend, another threat to European digital regulatory agenda, and that is, in addition to external pressures from the US, there are internal pressures. And those internal pressures reflect this European waning confidence that the Europeans should just be regulating technology. No, Europeans should also be developing these technologies. And that is because there is now a growing concern of the geopolitical vulnerability that Europeans should not be relying on Americans for technology because America may not be as reliable ally anymore. After all, the US has indicated that it doesn't share the same concerns about security of Ukraine, does not necessarily extend the security guarantees to Europe, and it has shown its willingness to wage a trade war against the Europeans. So Europeans feel that they are vulnerable if they rely on US technologies. So this has now led the Europeans to believe that we need to develop technologies, not just regulate them. And there's now this perception that by regulating the digital economy, the Europeans are constraining their own ability to develop a thriving tech economy. So that gives now ammunition for many groups who say that, look, we need to stop regulating so that we can start innovating.
Thank you. Beyond the privacy, we also need a guardrails against misuse and manipulation. Think misinformation, hyper-targeted nudges, and exploitative design. Here, regulation works as a barrier shield through GDPR, DSA, duties on content, transparency requirements, AI explainability with human oversight, and the EU AI Act ethical risk rules. Where are the biggest gaps, and what should platforms and enterprise uses of AI do right now to stay on the right side of these expectations?
So, as you very helpfully explained here, these are very complicated regulatory agendas. Just because of the volume of information that is being circulated in platforms and is now being supercharged with the generative AI that can generate more and more content. It can generate not just text, but video, voice, in a ways that really can potentially lead to just the new waves of misinformation, where we have a hard time as humans anymore to tell what is real and what is not, what is AI generated, what is truthful. And it really can distort with our understanding of reality, our understanding about what is fact and what is fiction. So this is something that we really need to be worried about. At the same time, we also know that some of the existing concerns, including our right to privacy, is now being invaded even more in the era of generative AI, where our personal data is an important ingredient for training AI models. So we see a lot of infringements of privacy when data is fed into these large language models. So our concerns around the regulation is even greater. I think what is difficult for the developers of AI models and the various deployers of these AI systems is that the regulatory framework is still very much in flux. It's new. We don't yet quite know how it's being implemented. So companies are looking for further guidance. And the European Union has given guidance. For instance, there's the code of practice on generative AI, which many of the companies have now signed onto, and that specifies many of the obligations. But at the same time, there's a lot of legal uncertainty for companies. For instance, what can they do with copyrighted material? Can they train their models with the data that is copyright protected? So there have been many issues where the companies feel that they don't have the clarity, and the regulators are still in the process of finalizing the rules, in the process of building effective enforcement institutions. So I think in the next couple of years, we still have this kind of gray zone where regulation is expected. Some regulations are out there, but there's not yet established practices that really give the companies the confidence on what compliance means.
Could you share your perspective of what kills innovation?
So I am not the believer that regulation necessarily kills innovation. There's often this idea that as long as you let the entrepreneurs to be free to explore, innovation will ensue. But of course, there are bad regulations. There are regulations that are not conducive to innovation. So I'm also not willing to say that all the regulations kill innovation. I would say that the kind of environment where you cannot freely explore, where you don't have the ability to really encourage the humans to reach new frontiers of innovation, to reach their potentials, take risks, try hard things, occasionally fail, but then try again. I think that's the kind of environment where innovation cannot thrive. It's too constrained, it's too restricted, and it doesn't give you that joyful exploration that ultimately is the foundation for innovation.
So, staying with innovation enablement, many breakthrough ideas emerge in Europe, yet the companies often scale outside the EU. For instance, DeepMind sale to Google is a well-known example. In your view, what specific EU factors most push scale-ups to exit or relocate? And what policy levers would best keep the next DeepMind growing at home?
So that's a really big question for the Europeans. Europeans are very concerned that the successful European companies are acquired by American tech giants. So they always list in the US, move to the US. And there are several reasons for that. So one is that the European Union market is still very fragmented. It is harder to scale your business in the EU. It's also harder to fund your business in the EU. Many of these businesses go to places where you have deep pockets and plenty of capital. And often the United States then provides that. In the AI space in particular, it is very attractive to go to the markets where you have a lot of compute, so you can have the hard power, the big models, that allows you to really take advantage of scale and that tremendous resources that are needed in this space. So some of the talented engineers prefer to have the most powerful computer so that they can develop foundation models. They want to go somewhere where the investment is flowing their way, where they have a big market to scale, where they have a diverse environment with talent from all around the world coalescing around this common enterprise, trying to push the boundaries of the frontier AI and other developments in this space. So partially, the Europeans need to make sure that the European Union and inside Europe, there are these thriving clusters for companies to innovate, meaning they are breaking the barriers, whether it's some harmful regulation, but also then the scaling impediments, the fragmentation that holds these companies back. There needs to be rethinking of labor market regulation and others that also allow the talent to move very freely. There needs to be the rethinking of the availability of capital. How can we unleash that capital so that you don't always need to leave Europe in order to find then greater capital available for you? So those are just some of the reasons that explain why many companies have left, and that would need to change for future companies to stay.
Moving on, we will be starting with identifying key success factors in connected intangible economy. Putting this together into success factors, let me highlight the point on the right. Strengthen service design with rapid iteration and experimentation. Hire and empower STEM talent willing to tackle hard problems. Foster a long-term growth environment, not short-term profit-taking, and for scale dynamics. Make proactive upfront bets, play to winner takes most. Secure risk capital and normalize smart failure. These are the practical levers behind product stickiness, cost per use falling with growth, and multi-service expansion. How winners are built in this economy. So next, let's discuss about why tech giants haven't emerged in EU. For many policymakers and business leaders, there is a strong assumption that the stronger regulation must come at the cost of innovation. That if we protect digital rights too tightly, we will fall behind in economic growth or competitiveness. But as you argue in the article, this is a false dilemma. Could you walk us through what motivates you to challenge this binary? Why is it so important for governments and business leaders to rethink this trade-off between innovation and regulation?
Yes, so I felt that there was a very simplistic but persistent narrative whereby large segments of the society just held on to this belief that digital regulation is the reason why the Europeans are not creating tech giants. And I understand it's very attractive to think that way because you look at how successful US tech companies have been, and then you observe that they have a market-driven regulatory model. They don't regulate this sector heavily. Then you focus on the rights-driven regulatory model in the EU. You know that there are many digital regulations. And then you ask, where is European Google? Where is European Apple? And they are nowhere to be seen. But I always felt that this was a rather simplistic narrative. So even if I just give you one anecdote, there was very little digital regulation in Europe before 2010. There was the Data Protection Directive that was a predecessor to the GDPR, But that was a rather lenient regulation. The GDPR was only adopted in 2016. The text-based antitrust cases didn't really start before 2010. Yet, at the time when companies like Facebook and Google were founded, we talk about 1998 and 2004, those companies were founded in the US. Even though there was very little digital regulation in the EU, still they did not emerge from the EU. So it doesn't really seem to be that digital regulation is the reason why these companies were not founded in the EU. So I decided that I want to take a closer look to try to understand what is then holding the European tech companies back, because I think it's very important for the tech companies and for the governments to understand what the real drivers and impediments for innovation are, because this is a key question for every economy. It's a key question for Europe, for the United States, but also for Japan and Korea and all the countries across the world, because they want to have innovation-friendly policies. Every government wants to innovate. But if there is this false assumption that digital regulations like privacy laws or AI laws are holding companies back and impeding innovation, many governments may just decide not to regulate. So if that is a false connection that is being made, I wanted to expose that. I wanted to really provide some tools for the governments to rethink whether they need to abandon their commitment to digital rights if they want to have innovation, whether they really need to make a choice, whether there's a trade-off, or if there's not a trade-off, what are other policies that are key for digital innovation so that the governments could be adopting those policies instead.
Here is a simple ladder of innovation readiness. It marks 7 levels: market size similarity, talent, capital, risk culture, bankruptcy protection, and how regulation works. Brad-san, here is our summary of key takeaways from your article. Could you please explain your ideas using this slide?
Yes, so then if I sort of wanted to convince everybody that it's not the digital regulation that is holding the European companies back, I wanted to focus on what are, to me, the key pillars of the American thriving tech ecosystem that may just be missing in Europe. And I arrived at these 4 reasons that, to me, are much more fundamental in explaining why the US has innovated so much more than Europe in this space. So one reason is that there is no digital single market in the European Union. It is much harder for tech companies to scale across 27 different countries that feature different languages, different cultural expectations, and often also different regulations. So obviously it was easier for Amazon to start as an online bookseller in the United States, where the demand for English-speaking books was uniform, whereas people in Italy and Sweden don't read the same books on the same language. But regulatory differences are the ones that are a policy choice, and they should be removed. Yet the European Union has often failed to really push that digital single market and eradicate those barriers that are now standing in the way of effective scaling. There's also the capital. That is a big explanatory variable why the American tech companies have been so successful. The US has a thriving venture capital market where it is very easy to fund those innovations. The European tech companies mainly rely on banks as opposed to venture capital, and banks are much more risk averse. They can get some venture funding early on, but as soon as they need more money, move to more advanced funding rounds, they often need to turn to US venture capital, or they are acquired by US tech giants. The US also has laws that has really allowed capital to flow into these venture capital funds, including by allowing institutional investors such as pension funds to invest in risky tech capital. The third issue, so in addition to integrated market and its absence in Europe and capital markets union, there is a set of legal and cultural barriers to risk-taking that are really holding the European tech entrepreneurs back. European countries have some of the most stringent punitive bankruptcy laws in the world. If you start a company and you try to do really hard things, it means that sometimes you fail. But in Europe, if you fail, you are often done. You don't raise money again. Whereas the United States has much more permissive bankruptcy regime. There is not the kind of policy whereby if you go through bankruptcy, you wouldn't be given money again. Instead, you will get more money because it seems like you're working hard things. There's much more of an idea in the US that success and failure follow one another. And after failure, there can be a success again. There's also not the kind of stigma culturally around failure in the United States that there is in the European Union. So that means that it's not embarrassing if you fail. That just means you're learning and then you're moving on. And that really nurtures entrepreneurship. And finally, a really big strength of the United States is that it has been able to recruit from the global pool of talents. You have the best AI scientists, the best tech entrepreneurs who choose to come to the US, often through top US universities, and then they benefit the US labor market by staying here. So over 50% of over $1 billion startups in the US have an immigrant founder. And I think it's striking, even if we just think about the leading tech giants and their founders. Just think about this. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, is a second-generation Cuban. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla and other companies, was born in South Africa. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, is Brazilian. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, is Russian. And Jensen Huang, the co-founder of NVIDIA, was born in Taiwan. So these are just some examples that I hope help illuminate that the reason the Europeans have not managed to create these world-leading tech companies is not because they have a GDPR. It's not because they have a rights-driven model. It's because they have failed to build these other critical pillars of a thriving tech ecosystem. By the same token, if the US now decided to adopt a federal privacy law, that would not dismantle the capital markets in the country. That would not rewrite the bankruptcy laws. And that alone would not cause the immigrants to leave the United States. So those are some of the issues that I think really are important differences between the US and the EU.
Thank you. As you mentioned, focusing on the talents, recent US policy shifts seem to work against high-skilled talent acquisition. Yet many top tech leaders, as you mentioned, in the US have been immigrants. What should firms and policymakers prioritize to keep the next generation of founders and CTOs onshore?
So the United States has now really moved forcefully against immigration. It is a cultural and legal shift in the United States when the country starts pursuing restrictive immigration policies. And I must say that this is really working against this idea that if we now understand how important immigration has been for the tech success of the country. So the United States risks undermining the very pillar of success, what has made the US so tremendously successful. Because then these migrants, if they no longer come to the US, if they no longer feel welcome to US universities, if they no longer get an H-1B visa, which is an important visa category for skilled migrants to stay in the US, they may go elsewhere. China will certainly welcome its top engineers back. Yeah. And then one question is, will Japan welcome them? Will Europe welcome them? Will the Canadians, Australians, who will welcome all this talent? Because that is a tremendous opportunity. And personally, I would say that I really hope for the United States' sake that it takes a hard look to understand how important of a role the immigrants have played in this country's tech success. And that might cause the government to rethink whether the immigration policies that it's pursuing right now ultimately will be one of the biggest threats to the technological dominance of the United States.
Thank you. To conclude, we mapped how Gen AI reshapes markets and society, contrasted EU-US governance and cross-border frictions, showed why rights and competition rules can enable, not block innovation, and outlined the success factors and policy levers to balance early scale with trust. Our goals are aligned. We are lighting the way to a brighter society. Professor Bradford-san, what lessons or strategic insight should leaders of Japanese companies particularly focus on?
So I would say that this is a really difficult but also exciting time to be a business leader. So for Japanese companies to navigate these increasingly complicated markets and the unprecedented levels of uncertainty really means that for Japanese companies to thrive and to be successful, they need to understand not just their business and their product. They need to understand deeply technology, changes in technology. They need to understand regulation and the limits that come from regulation. They need to understand geopolitics and how geopolitics can change regulation within weeks and months. So they need to think about very strategic calculations, understand different markets. The markets will remain global. The tensions remain global. So they need to understand how Americans think, how Chinese think, how Europeans think, how those different philosophies now combined with the geopolitical constraints are translating into the kind of regulatory environment that they need to navigate to be successful. There are tremendous challenges, but these challenges are for everyone. So in many ways, the ones who prevail are the ones who will not lose their focus from what good products, good technology, good innovation, and acute strategic insight can bring to them, but who are also very nimble and capable of changing their analysis, incorporate all this new information about the changing strategic environment. It is challenging, but there are also opportunities. And that's why I think it just requires leadership at the highest possible level of these companies.
Thank you. Thank you. A good direct session. Thank you.